Good evening and welcome to the 7th of the 2014 Darwin College Lectures, which is on the broad theme of plagues. And welcome to all of you here tonight on this day with bad traffic jams outside, and also the many thousands of people who will watch these lectures later on the web without having to be concerned about a traffic jam. This is, as you will know, a very important year for Darwin College as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the foundation. As the first college in the University of Cambridge, exclusively for graduate students, and also the first mixed college. And from a small beginning, we are now amongst the largest colleges with an alumni body that encompasses every subject and is spread right around the world. Now, this evening, I'm very pleased to welcome our lecturer, Professor Ian Morris, who's going to consider the economic aspect of plagues. Ian studied archaeology as an undergraduate at Birmingham University and then moved here to Cambridge for his PhD and a fellowship, and then on to a faculty position at the University of Chicago. So returning here to Cambridge, he's very much in his old haunts. Then in 1996, he became the Jean and Rebecca Willard Professor of Classics and Archaeology at Stanford University. His research interests have broadened over his career from ancient Greece to global questions about world history. He's an author of a good number of books. His book, Why the West Rules, for now, won 3 international book awards, was named a 2010 Book of the Year by The Economist, was one of the 100 most notable books of 2011 by the New York Times, and one of the best reads for 2011 by Nature. His 2013 book is The Measure of Civilization: How Social Development Decides the Fate of Nations. Well, are plagues always really damaging for societies? Or are there circumstances under which a society can advance after a plague? Ian is going to examine and compile examples of historic and ancient plagues and seek to predict how the economies of our 21st century might respond to plagues. So I very warmly welcome Professor Ian Morris to speak on plagues and economic collapse.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and thank you for turning out on this sort of rather gloomy day. It's great to be here. I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to give this lecture, and it's nice to be in here. I have vivid memories. I was just saying before we came over, vivid memories of sitting in this room listening to Ernest Gellner to one of the Darwin lectures, in which was apparently in the very first season of them. Many years ago. This was in like 1986 or so. But anyway, I've been invited here this evening to talk about plagues and economic collapse. And I'm going to be focusing on one question, which is, do plagues cause economic collapse? And the answer, I can tell you, is a resounding sometimes. So now I'll spend 50 minutes telling you about that. So it's a question that, if you're coming at this from a historical angle, it's a question where there's no shortage of sources to work with, looking at this. In many plagues throughout history, a lot has been written about them by people who lived through them, and generally they all seem to have pretty similar attitude that the world is ending. So you read the material written by the people who experienced the plagues, and they give their own very resounding answers to the question about collapse. Probably the most famous of the people who wrote about this, Arab writer Ibn Khaldun, lived through the Black Death in the 14th century, and he put it pretty forcefully. Civilization in both the East and the West was visited by a destructive plague that devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. So Ibn Khaldun in no two minds about this topic. And this seems to be a fairly common sense reaction to a plague. But I think, in fact, when you look at the long-term history of plagues, clearly there's a bit more going on here. And my general sense of the picture is that you can't really say that plagues cause economic collapse, although they certainly can be involved in collapse. Sometimes they do seem to play a part in this. I come to this question as a historian and an archaeologist. As you just heard, I began my life as an archaeologist of ancient Greece. Here I am beginning as an archaeologist of ancient Greece. Who is this handsome brute, you ask yourself? That is me back in 1989, digging on a site in Greece. And I started off focusing on the rise of ancient Greek city-states between about 1000 and 500 BC. And I've been having a sort of trip down memory lane this week. On Wednesday, I gave a talk at Birmingham University, where I was an undergraduate, and I hadn't been back on the campus there in over 30 years. So that was just very, very weird. And now here I am, where I was a graduate student, and I spent today meeting with some of my old buddies from the old days, and I'm sure some of you will know Paul Cartledge and Peter Garnsey, and my dissertation advisor, Anthony Snodgrass, some of the leading lights of classical archaeology. It's been very nice to be back. But as I sort of went on being a classical archaeologist, one of the things I noticed early on in my own work was that if I broadened the perspective on things that I was interested in, problems I was trying to deal with, it often changed the way I saw the problem, and then new answers started to appear. And as time has gone on, I found I'm taking a broader and broader perspectives on the work that I'm doing. After starting off digging mostly in ancient Greece itself, I ran for some years an excavation out in the western end of Sicily, and another beautiful place. One of the great things about being a classical archaeologist is all these guys live near the beach, and they were very sensible ancient people. So I found broaden the perspective, the geographical, chronological perspective tended to open up new answers to the old questions. But I found what it also did was it started to push new questions onto me. I started to feel more and more, not just does this give me a new way of seeing an old problem, but it suggests a whole new set of problems. And the old problems often started to seem just a little bit small compared to the problems that were being opened up by a larger perspective. And in the process, I also found, which I think very appropriate tonight, I became more and more of a Darwinian as this went on. I think that the bigger the scale you look at history on, the harder it is not to think about it in evolutionary terms, although some people do manage, but they are just wrong. So I sort of moved in this direction. And a few years ago, I wrote the book that was mentioned just a moment ago, a book called Why the West Rules for Now, where what I tried to do in that was I tried to look at 15,000 years of history to try to get some sense of why it was that a fairly small group of nations around the shores of the North Atlantic came to dominate the whole planet in the last couple of hundred years. And in the process of writing this book, the way I went about it was to construct an index of social development, to measure how these societies developed over time. And I raised that, because I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. We'll be drawing on this a little bit tonight. But what I was doing in this book was looking at the big trends in world history and saying, can we identify the trends that have driven the historical process? Can we project them forward to talk about where they might take us next? And can we also see what kind of forces derailed these trends in the past? Can we identify what caused the big collapses in the past, the big social collapses? And I felt there was a pattern you could see whenever you dealt with big social collapses in history. The same group of forces came up again and again, in almost all the cases when you look at these collapses. And I cheerfully called them the Five Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And one of the mass migration, migration on a bigger scale than societies and institutions could cope with. Often as a consequence of this, you would get huge epidemic diseases, often driven by the merging of what had previously been separate disease pools. They come together and no one really has many of the antibodies they need to defend themselves against these diseases. You get massive kill-offs. Often as a consequence of that, state failure. The governments just can't cope with what's going on. Things fall apart. Often a consequence of that, famine follows on the back of it. The trade routes dry up. Thousands, millions of people starve. And then always mixed in somewhere, although always in different ways, climate change always seems to be a part of these things. So these things come up again and again together. Of the epidemic diseases, of course, the most famous example of this kind of collapse, the big epidemic disease involved, is the Ibn Khaldun plague that I started off talking about in the 14th century, the Black Death. Possibly began as early as 1331 in Central Asia, certainly by the 1340s. It's raging across a wide area of the Old World. Kills, estimates vary, kills somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population in Europe, out Western End, in the middle. Oh, do I have a pointy thing in this? Oh, well, I can't figure it out anyway. But well, you know where the Middle East is. I don't really need to point. So 1/3 to 1/2 of the population in Europe, the Middle East, and China. It seems not to have seriously impacted India, Southeast Asia, Japan, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas. So it is a select part of the world, but massive kill-off goes on. Devastating effects. Ibn Khaldun's sentiments echoed over and over again. Here's an Italian writer, Matteo Villani, who lived in Florence during the plague. As far as can be found in written records, there has been no more widespread judgment by mortal illness from the universal deluge to the present, nor one that embraced more of the universe than the one which has occurred in our own day. So, devastating mortality. But did it cause an economic collapse? The most famous plague in history. Did this cause an economic collapse? My topic tonight. Basically, as so often in academia, it depends on what you mean by an economic collapse. And then now come to the, if you want to step out for a moment, the compulsory boring part of every lecture, where you have to define what you're talking about, explain what some of the terms mean. And obviously, if we're talking about plague and economic collapse, these are terms that we do have to decide what exactly we mean by them. With economic collapse, this is now coming back to this theme about social development that I mentioned earlier. I constructed this development index for one of my earlier books. Basically, what I meant by social development was society's ability to get things done in the world. And I put it a bit more formally in my books, and although one of my pet hatreds is people who read out PowerPoint slides, I'm not going to do that to you anyway, because I can, really. And I think this is a useful way to approach the issue of economic collapse, and a useful tool for definitions. And basically what I got in mind by social development is the bundle of technological, subsistence, organizational, and cultural accomplishments through which people feed, house, clothe, and reproduce themselves, explain their world around them, resolve disputes within their communities, extend their power at the expense of other communities, and defend themselves against others' attempts to extend their power. And a very broad thing, but basically a group's ability to master its physical and intellectual environment and use this mastery to get what the people want from the world. And in principle, at least, I think this is something that can be measured and compared across space and time. And I expounded at enormous, staggering length, in fact, in another book that was mentioned, this book, The Measure of Civilization, where I go into a ridiculous level of detail about how I constructed this index and the evidence I used. So I won't bore you with any of that stuff tonight, because even to me this is actually extremely dull stuff. I won't bore you with how I went about it, but the reason I bring it up is I think this is a useful metric to allow you to establish what you are using as the limits of economic collapse, what the phenomenon is. Social development, falling social development is clearly a form of collapse. Having a numerical index allows you to sort of play around with setting different thresholds. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. How much does development have to fall before you talk about it as a collapse? You can decide for yourself what you think that should be. But having the numerical index allows you to say, well, what happens if we set the threshold to, say, a 10% collapse, decline? That counts as a collapse. Or a 5% or a 20%. You can sort of play around with this. So, for the sake of argument, I thought, well, let's say we'll count situations where social development falls by 10%. We'll count that as being a serious collapse. Now, by that standard, the Black Death of the 14th century meets the barrier for counting as one of these collapses. Although only just, and here is a graph of some of my numbers, dates along the bottom, social development scores on the vertical axis, the blue line representing western parts of the world, the red line representing eastern parts, which is another thing you can argue over the definitions, but I think we don't need to get into that right now. By this 10% cutoff, the Black Death, 14th century, would just about qualify as having triggered a collapse. The Eastern and Western social development scores each fell about 11% across the 14th century, as I calculated them. But, and this is where I think it becomes interesting, if we extend out our timescale beyond the year 1400, we see a rather peculiar thing about the Black Death, the most famous of these plagues. After this 11% decline in social development in the 14th century, across the next 400 years, both of these regions see really quite spectacular increases in development. In the eastern part of the world, development rises by 39% between 1400 and 1800. In the western part, it shoots up by even more than that. I mean, these are extraordinary improvements, like 71% or something that the Western score rises by. This is the biggest increase across a 400-year period up to that point in history that I was able to identify. So what do we get from this? Well, one possible conclusion would be that, in this case, plague leads to collapse and then greater recovery. That plagues are bad in the short run, but good in the long run. That's one possible interpretation to read into this. And in fact, this is sort of how European historians have looked at the Black Death for quite a long time, even before they had the benefit of my social development index. If you look back at your classic tome like the Cambridge Economic History of Europe, this is sort of the way it talks about the Black Death, or the French annalist historians in the mid-20th century. And broadly, they take a kind of Malthusian approach to this, that plagues tend to break out when population is pressing against subsistence limits. They sharply reduce the number of people, and the result of this is a bounce back after the plague. A broadly Malthusian take. And lots of Western European sources talking about the Black Death talk about it in very much these terms. They say the plague just changed everything. The plague shook up social relations enormously. And a lot of the best evidence about this actually comes from right around this area, from Cambridge and Ely, where the great peasants' revolts breaks out around here in the late 14th century. The king has to come and meet with revolting peasants. Great changes in social order begin in the late 14th century. So lots of historians think this is very much what happens. You collapse and then a greater revival. And this, I think, is one of the ways in which, when you start looking at these things on a longer time scale, that a sort of broadly Darwinian evolutionary framework is very, very helpful. I mean, one of the things evolutionists like, sometimes social as well as biological, sometimes like to talk about, is to say that you can think of evolution as operating in a sort of a fitness landscape, is the term people will often use. And they'll say, imagine, here's a diagram I stole from somebody else's book, but imagine we've got a sort of a graph kind of thing going here, and the vertical going up is the level of the excellence of adaptation of an organism or society to its environment. Evolution is a path-dependent kind of thing. You can't suddenly sprout a third arm because it would be useful. You just can't do that if you don't have the prior third armness available to you. You can only sort of go up out of the track you're in. So they say for each kind of species of animal, each society, it's developed down a certain path. It can carry on moving sort of up the hill on this diagram, becoming better and better evolved to fit in with its landscape. But even though there's a possible peak you can see up at the top in the middle of the graph there, of an organism or a society that could be much better adapted to its landscape, its environment, than the ones that actually exist. The ones that actually exist, the sort of railway track-looking things, they can't get over there, because you can't. You're not going to evolve toward a less successful adaptation to your landscape, because that would not be evolution. It's not going to happen. The only way you can leap up to these potential higher peaks would be if something happens to level this fitness landscape. And this, social evolutionists sometimes suggest, this is the way plagues work. This is the collapse, then the recovery phenomenon. They level the old hills, and societies move off in new directions. And what historians have suggested over and over again is what happens with the Black Death is it's really the death knell of feudalism. This collapse in population it clears off the landscape, allows societies to start moving toward capitalist forms, which turn out to be much better adaptations to this environment. And by 1500, population is recovering sharply in Europe, but some societies have begun to take on very new social relations, and a capitalist takeoff begins. So out of the collapse at the end of the Black Death comes growth. So this has been the standard story for a long time. But over the last 40 years or so, there's been this series of challenges to it, which I think complicates the picture in sort of interesting ways. And back in the 1970s, a Marxist historian, a guy named Brenner, came up with what became known as the Brenner hypothesis. And what Brenner did was he said, let's look at the Black Death, but instead of doing like everybody does and focusing on Cambridge and Ely and Paris, basically, let's look at the whole of Europe. So a very varied fitness landscape now. And what happens? He says, well, what we find when we look on this larger scale, he says, different outcomes proceeded from similar demographic trends at different times in different areas of Europe. The same pressures of population could and did lead to changes in the distribution of income favourable to the lords or the peasants, opposite outcomes, depending on the social property relationships and the balances of class forces. So a little bit of 1970s Marxist speak in there. But basically what he's saying is that it all depends. The Black Death in some places led to the take-off of capitalist institutions. In other places it didn't. Depending on where a particular society was in the fitness landscape, you got wildly different results when the population collapsed. And basically, west of the Elbe River in Europe, you get the take-off of capitalist institutions. East of it, you don't. You get what historians often call the new feudalism. Poland, Russia, all kinds of other places. Feudalism revives much more strongly. Now, in the last 15 or 20 years, a new set of ideas, driven by new evidence about the impact of the Black Death, this has come on the scene very, very strongly. Historians have succeeded in putting together very long series of data on real wages in different parts of Europe in particular. And this has pushed people to think in new ways about the Black Death. And in some parts of Europe, these wage data go all the way back to the 13th century. And so what the historians looking at the wage data have been able to suggest, that the Black Death, sort of by definition, it transforms the land-labour ratio, two of the three basic inputs in an economy, land, labour and capital. Black Death transforms the land-labour ratio by just killing a lot of people. So there's now a lot more land available relative to the size of the population, relative to the labour force available. Labour, the demand for labour increases sharply. What we should expect from that is that real wages will increase sharply, and that is exactly what happens. I'm now going to show you one of my favourite graphs, what we serious people like to call a spaghetti graph. Many, many lines. I'll show you a simpler version of this in just a moment, but the reason I put this one up is, in spite of all the lines going on, each of the lines, you can see the key at the bottom, represents a different town from 1300 to 1750. In spite of the proliferation of lines, we see some pretty clear trends here, but then I'm using this graph because of one particular line in it. So we see that over on the right, from 1300 to about 1450, basically wages are going up pretty much everywhere during the period immediately after the Black Death. Then from about 1450, 1500, down to about 1600 or so, wages are falling almost everywhere as population grows and the land-labour ratio generally shifts against labour. Then after 1600, other stuff starts happening. I'll come back to in just a second about what's going on the right-hand side of the graph. Basically, we see this up, then down with the wages. And we see it all across Europe. It's not just in Western Europe that this happens. And as you can see from the key, the bottom right in the key, the black blob with the dotted lines is Krakow in Poland, the one town when this graph was drawn for in Eastern Europe for which wage series have been put together. And to save you from having to look at me for the whole of the lecture, you can try to see if you can pick out the Krakow line, the mess of spaghetti up there. But basically it follows pretty much the same trends as the other lines from Europe. In spite of the different institutional political outcomes, east and west of the Elbe, the real wages seem to follow roughly the same trends. And all over Europe, when you look at later historical sources, all over Europe, they look back on the 15th century as this golden age, a time of cakes and ale. They often call it in Western Europe cakes and ale. When standards of living for ordinary people are higher than we're going to see again until the 19th century. The period around 1450 really was a golden age for peasants, insofar as peasants get a golden age. And this is what it would look like. Now, up till very recently, Europe was pretty much the only place we could do this sort of stuff with the real wages. That's beginning to change now. And just about 3 weeks ago, an article was published for the first time giving us some Middle Eastern data like this. Now, I owe this reference actually to somebody many of you I'm sure will know. One of my colleagues at Stanford named Walter Scheidel, who was a Finley Fellow here at Darwin College back in the 1990s. And Walter drew my attention to this article in the Journal of Economic History, giving us some data from Cairo and Baghdad and Istanbul as well. And it's not a great data set. It's full of holes. I think there's a lot of room to argue over what exactly it means. But again, we're looking at real wages. Basically, the higher you go and the scores on the vertical axis, the better off you are. Dates along the bottom. And the guys who published this graph suggest that the data from Cairo seem to fit generally with the European pattern, that we see rising real wages in the aftermath of the Black Death, falling as population starts to grow again later. Out in China, we don't have any quantitative data at this point available, but the qualitative evidence sounds very similar. The 15th century golden age, then, things get harder and harder. So the real wage data seem to suggest that plagues don't necessarily lead to collapse, don't necessarily lead to collapse followed by revival either. They lead to a temporary respite from misery. Real wage data seem to suggest that things get better for ordinary people rapidly after a plague and then deteriorate as the population grows. So we've got some very different theories knocking around, all of them driven by the Black Death episode, but very different theories knocking around over whether plagues cause economic collapses or what on earth they actually do. So what I'd like to do with what remains of my time is sort of out-Brenner, by making a broader comparison still and trying to look at other examples we know of plagues and say, can we draw some broader conclusions here? My inspiration in doing this is a very, now almost 40-year-old, but very well-known book, William McNeill's Plagues and Peoples, which I'm sure some of you will come across. Wonderful book if you haven't read it. Absolutely great book. But he tries to write a whole history of the interrelation of humanity and its plagues, and it's a pioneering piece of work. And one of the things you learn from McNeill's book is there have been a lot of plagues, and we know quite a lot about some of them. Enough, in fact, that we can begin to do some comparative work. And this, of course, raises the second definitional problem. What exactly do we count as a plague? If we limit it just to things like the bubonic and pneumonic plagues of the 14th century, obviously that cuts out an awful lot of the comparisons. I'm sure there are questions for which that would be a useful limit, but I don't think it's very useful for this one. So I'm going to be talking about plagues just as big outbreaks of contagious diseases that lead to very high mortality, which is a very, very broad, loose definition. You can argue over how much mortality should you have to count as a plague. Seems to me if you've got 10% mortality on a fairly, hopelessly vague, but fairly large scale, you are dealing with something that's worth calling a plague here. The 14th century Black Death very much qualifies, probably half the population in Europe probably, maybe as much as 10% of the global population killed in the 14th century. Possibly things like the H1N1 influenza after World War I, the AIDS epidemic, possibly these should not be counted as plagues. And of course, we sometimes talk of them as plagues, but when we do, I think most people are using the word somewhat metaphorically. So it defines out some cases, defines in others. Possibly the most severe plague in history, other than the Black Death, was one which I think is a very useful comparison, going back to the 2nd century AD, the Antonine plague, as it's called by people who study the Roman Empire. This is one we don't actually know for sure what it was. There's been no DNA recovered so far connected to it, but probably it's something to do with smallpox. This breaks out, the first we hear of it is in 161 AD on the northwest frontiers of the Han Chinese Empire, marked in yellow over on the right here. 5 years later, 166, we hear of what sounds like a very similar illness breaking out in northern Syria, the edge of the Roman Empire. It's probably been communicated across the steppes by horse-based nomads, probably is fueled by the merging of these previously separate disease pools. Enormous mortality, although there's great argument over what the numbers actually were, but enormous mortality in both these ancient empires. In the Roman Empire, we've got enough quantitative data that we can begin talking a little bit about its impact on real wages. And my colleague Walter Scheidel, again, has suggested that real wages increased by about 20% in Egypt in the late 2nd century AD, probably as a result of this plague, which is exactly what the economists would lead us to believe. No Chinese data have been quantified properly yet, but again, the qualitative data suggests we're dealing with something a little bit similar. The Antonine plague, though, the 2nd century plague, has very different long-run effects from the Black Death in Europe. The Antonine plague unambiguously leads to collapse everywhere it shows up. And these are the social development scores, again, red for the East, blue for the West, in the period from 1 AD through to about 500. And both areas, but particularly the western end of Eurasia, see serious declines in social development scores across this period. The western score falls by about a quarter across these 500 years. The eastern score by less, about 10% by 300 AD, and then begins recovering. So very different outcomes from the Black Death. Another great plague starts in the Mediterranean world in 541. This is often called the Justinianic plague. This kills maybe a third of the population of the Byzantine Empire. Something that sounds rather similar to it is raging in the early 7th century in China, although it's hard to be sure it's exactly the same thing. The qualitative evidence suggests that wages bounce up in the Byzantine Empire in the aftermath of this. Our most significant piece of evidence comes from a guy called John the Deacon. John the Deacon is a Christian bishop living in Constantinople, and John complains bitterly because he can't get his laundry done anymore. The plague has killed all the laundry people in Constantinople, and now to get your laundry done you have to pay a fortune. And I mean, seems like a strikingly un-Christian attitude to take in the wake of mass mortality. But this is what John talks about. And this gives you a sense of the quality of the evidence as well. This is about as good evidence as we're getting on wages in the early Byzantine Empire. But it's certainly in Egypt where the data are relatively good. Again, we get some kind of spike in wages in the 7th to 8th centuries. The Middle Eastern historians who put together the graph I showed you a version of a second ago, they suggest that maybe this indicates a similar kind of rise in wages in the 8th and 9th centuries in the aftermath of this plague. I'm not entirely convinced by that one, I must say. But the picture is perhaps a bit more mixed with what this plague does. And particularly I think this is true of the social development scores. The blue line again in the west, the red line again in the east, dates across the bottom. So after the 6th century AD, Western social development continues tumbling. Eastern social development, though, is rising relatively rapidly. And in fact, the fall in development in the West between about 100 and 700 AD, this is the biggest sustained fall on record that I'm aware of in history. It falls by like 34% across this period. And this is a terrible social collapse. There's lots of other plagues we can look at. All of them add more details, more variation in the outcomes. The famous plague that raged in Athens in 430 BC, which the DNA suggests was typhoid fever. This may have killed a quarter of the population, but has a completely different set of results. The Columbian exchange, when Europeans go to the Americas in the 16th century. Again, a cocktail of diseases that is inflicted on the native population. Smallpox, again, seems to be a big part of this. Great debate over just how many people died. A lot of recent work has suggested the mortality rate was actually something like 90%. The DNA evidence suggests it was actually more like 50%, but it's still absolutely massive kill-off. But the effect's different again. The Americas get incorporated into a European-dominated economy, and social development on the whole rises. But of course, very, very different things are going on. I could go on at even more length about all the different plagues we know about, all the different things happening. Basic picture, though, is there's lots of different outcomes in economic terms with different plagues, different times and places. It's easy, as I was sort of trying to put this talk together, I realize it's easy to just degenerate into a laundry list here of horrible plagues and the things they did to people. Clearly, the outcomes depend on the specifics of the case and exactly what else was going on. But having said that, I think it is useful to think a little bit about some patterns that we see here. How a social system responds to a great plague depends very much on the details, I think, of what else is happening. And so I'm going to, just for a minute or two, compare what happens with the Black Death with what happens with the ancient Roman Antonine plague in the 2nd century. So I think the comparison is a little bit revealing. And with the Black Death, like I said, the big outcome seems to be this decline in development, this collapse, followed by a much bigger surge in development and the size of the economy after 1400. The European labour markets respond in just the way Malthus said they should. The wages rise in the 14th century, decline in the 15th and 16th as population is growing. But then, as I said, I was going to come back to the right-hand side of this spaghetti graph. Something rather interesting starts to happen. You see over the right-hand side of the graph, there's this mass of coils of spaghetti starts to separate out into two trends after about 1600 AD, 1650 AD. A small group of northwest European cities see sustained increases in standards of living for ordinary people, whereas the cities of southern Europe and eastern Europe generally see declining, slower, but still declining standards of living across the 17th and 18th century. So this bifurcation is beginning in Europe at this period. Even though population continues to grow in northwest Europe, grows in fact very fast, the wages are behaving in non-Malthusian ways. There's enormous argument about why this is happening. Economic historians get very passionate about this. My own feeling is that what really drives this divergence is the creation of a new kind of economy around the Atlantic Ocean. As the technologies develop to the point the Atlantic can be mastered and brought within an economic system, wealth starts to flow into northwest Europe. The Europeans create what... I'm sorry, I was going to show you. This is a simplified version of the graph. I should have put this up first, where you can see this divergence a lot more clearly here. The divergence is driven by wealth flowing into northwest Europe by the creation of what historians like to call triangular trades in the Atlantic Ocean, where the ocean is big enough that there are very different societies and ecologies around it, but small enough that you can zip around in ships, buying and selling different things at different points, generating profits everywhere you stop, creating wealth on a scale that the world has never seen before. And Northwest Europeans are relative latecomers to this Atlantic economy. The Spaniards have already got all the good bits of the New World, where all the gold and the silver is. The Europeans are forced to try to make money in different ways. And the Northwest Europeans are the ones who discover the possibilities of integrating the shores of the Atlantic into a single gigantic economy. They develop and dominate this triangular trade. So European wages generally fall after 1500 or even 1450 as population grows. But then by 1600 in northwest Europe, wages are going up again as this Atlantic economy absolutely booms. More and more Europeans are drawn into a labour market, selling their labour power than has ever been the case before. Historians often talk about an industrious revolution as opposed to an industrial revolution in this period, as people are working more and more and the European economy is booming. Now, nothing like that happened in the aftermath of the 2nd century AD Antonine plague, where we get much more sustained long-term economic decline, a 700-year decline, really. Again, we probably see labour markets responding to plague in a very Malthusian way of rising wages followed by falling wages as the population recovers. Again, we see something rather like what happens after the Black Death, with the changing meaning of geography. After the Black Death, the Atlantic has changed from being a barrier into being this great economic highway. The geography that changes during the period of the Antonine plague is a very, very different phenomenon with very different consequences. This time, the part of the world that seems to change its meaning is the steppes, the great band of grasslands stretching from Manchuria to Hungary. Perfect horse breeding territory. Once you've got big horses, perfect territory for riding around a lot, moving from waterhole to waterhole. Great place for people to build up large numbers of cavalry to raid and steal stuff from empires. The band of empires that stretches from China to the Mediterranean. during this period, the steppes go from being this barrier to the north of the great band of empires across the old world. They go from being a barrier to being a sort of highway. But the only people who can use this highway are people with well-developed forces of cavalry, very large reliance on horses. And what happens is that from about 200 AD through to about 1400, the great empires from the Mediterranean to China never really get military domination over the steppes. They're always vulnerable to invasions from the steppes, which fill the literature of the period. Here are just some shots of randomly selected Mongol pictures, Mongols devastating everything in their path. Over and over again, great empires are overthrown by invasions from the steppes. And in fact, the general picture that we get of the stability of states across this period, here's another spaghetti graph looking at great empires of different regions, Europe, the Middle East, China, and India. From the year 1 AD to 1400, the area of the largest states in each region, expressed in millions of square kilometers on the vertical axis. The purple line, what you see is a median to median regression line to the sizes of these empires. Basically, it's a steady decline in the size of empires across this period as the steppes become more and more of a superhighway for nomadic bandits. Great empires are never able to re-establish themselves after the Antonine collapse sets in. They are never able to recreate great economic systems that quite rival the Roman one, or at least not until about the 12th century when Song Dynasty China does something comparable, although it never really exceeds what the Romans did. Now, this cycle of economic chaos and breakdown, this gets broken around the year 1400 by two developments, not the kind of things that you might expect to break a downward economic cycle, but the two big developments. Ironically, they are pioneered in China, but then really exploited and perfected in Europe. The two developments are ocean-going ships and guns. And what you see at the top left is a modern reproduction of a 15th century Chinese junk. This vessel could have sailed absolutely anywhere in the world if it had chosen to do so. Bottom right is the oldest known true gun in the world, found on the battlefield in Manchuria. By true gun, I mean a gun where gunpowder explodes violently enough to propel a projectile out of the tube and kill somebody on the other end of it. Oldest known true gun in the world, about 1288, found in Manchuria. Here we've got the European versions, much adapted naval maritime technology you see in one replica of one of Columbus's ships from the end of the 15th century. Bottom right, the oldest European representation of a gun. This was painted on a manuscript in Oxford in 1329. This is 41 years after the world's first known gun appears. No invention in the history of the world had ever spread as fast as the gun, which is one of the reasons why I think gun control in America is doomed not to succeed. Everybody loves guns. Now, this package, once it was put in place together, basically Asians used guns to close the steppe highway down. Europeans used ships and guns to open up the oceans and turn the Atlantic into a highway. This, I think, accounts for the differences in the outcomes after the Black Death and the Antonine Plague centuries earlier. Now, lots and lots more comparisons are possible, lots more lessons we could try to draw out of this. But I think a couple of conclusions emerge. One of the things historians have a bad reputation for is always adding more complexity and more details, muddying the patterns more and more. But I think often, though, with comparative history, what happens, like in a lot of fields, you start off with very simple pictures. When you know almost nothing, when you've only got 2 data points, you can always join them with a straight line. You know almost nothing, the story is simple. You learn more and more, it becomes a complete mess and you don't know anything. You get to a certain point, though, where you've got enough data, you do begin to see some big patterns emerging. I think we can do this with the historical comparison of plagues. So a couple of things I think we can say after looking at a variety of historical cases. And the first of them is that, by definition, if a plague is something that kills a lot of people, by definition, plagues shift the land-labour ratio in favour of the labourers. This drives up wages, weakens the positions of employers and landlords, leads to something of a golden age for ordinary people in the aftermath of the plagues. But relatively quickly, the balance will shift back again as the population recovers. And it seems to vary how long it takes, but typically I think 3 generations seems to be a good ballpark figure for how long it'll take to get you back to where you were before the plague had struck. And this, I think, is a valid generalization that can be applied to pretty much all of these cases. And the exception that proves the rule, I think, is Northwest Europe after 1600, where we see that what makes the European experience so different and leads to this really sustained recovery rather than sort of return to where things had been before, is that population is expanding, but markets and productivity are expanding even faster. And that, I think, is what makes the big difference. Markets and productivity grow faster than population. And that makes a big change. The Industrial Revolution then accelerates this growth even more, changes things even further. So that, I think, is the first generalization. Second point I think we can draw out of all these plague stories is that the plagues don't directly cause economic collapse. They're a shock to a system, and people have got ways of doing things. A plague dramatically shocks this and shakes it up. And in the wrong circumstances, by which I mean basically when the plague comes as part of this bundle of 5 horsemen of the apocalypse, in the wrong circumstances, plagues can be a major factor leading toward economic and social collapse. And this is what we see, of course, in the 2nd century AD and after, what we see with the Justinianic plague of the 6th and 7th centuries. So, okay, what can we learn, to wrap up, what can we learn from this long-term comparative history? Can it make any useful suggestions for us about where things might be going in the 21st century? And I think maybe it can, at least in broad terms. And I think clearly, I guess if you've been coming to these plague lectures, you will have heard a lot about this already, about the likelihood of plagues in the 21st century. It seems to me fairly clear we are at great risk of major epidemic diseases spreading rapidly around the world. This is nobody can say whether this is going to happen on a major scale, but the risk of it happening is enormous. And the speed of transportation, I think, is obviously one of the major things that's made the risk so much higher than it's tended to be in the past. And it's very easy to document, I think, this by looking across the history of 20th century mass epidemic diseases. The H1N1 influenza that I mentioned earlier on, that broke out at the end of the First World War in 1918. There's debates about how exactly this got started and what spread it, but clearly the movement of very, very large numbers of young men back and forth across the Atlantic is one of the big things. It killed probably 50 million people in 1918 to 1919. Probably a little bit of debate, but it probably broke out in US Army camps in France originally. Probably involved disease jumping from pigs and kept at the camp to humans, and then it spread among the humans. Spreads across the entire planet, is just devastating, and then it burns itself out relatively quickly. The AIDS virus. I mean, AIDS seems to have been incubating in Africa since at least about 1959, maybe even earlier than that. Not spreading all that much, though. Not a lot of mobility taking it out of Africa. And then in the 1980s, it abruptly spreads across 4 continents. SARS is identified in 2003 in the space of 37. It's identified in 37 countries within the first few weeks of the first cases being identified in East Asia. Dramatic increase in the speed and scale at which these diseases are spreading. Of course, the other side of the same coin is there's a dramatic increase in the speed of our ability to respond to these diseases. Back with the H1N1 virus in 1918, there was not a lot that could be done about this. I mean, there's more that could be done with any earlier plague, but not a lot could be done in 1918. With AIDS, the HIV genome gets sequenced after about 15 years. They figure out what the actual genome is. With SARS, it's sequenced in 31 days. So you're just a spectacular increase in the speed of our ability to respond. Now, of course, we don't know if we will carry on winning the race against these diseases in the 21st century. And whether we do or not, a 21st century plague is going to be pretty horrendous. And the World Health Organization estimates that if a new influenza version, which of course they're evolving constantly, if a new version were to break out, And if it were to behave, excuse me, like the H2N2 virus that broke out in 1957, which is a relatively mild version of flu, that killed 1 to 2 million people in 1957. A new version, if it behaved like that, would kill between 2 and 7.4 million people. If it behaved like the 1918 H1N1 virus, it would kill something like 200 million people. So that's a scary statistic. The World Bank estimates that a pandemic, they're a little vague about what they mean exactly by pandemic, they estimate that it would knock 5% off world GDP. A lot of people think that's actually a very conservative estimate. The World Health Organization has a really cheery page on its website, which it calls the 10 things you need to know about pandemic influenza. And I'm not going to give you all 10 of them, but just picked out my 5 favorite things you need to know about pandemic influenza. It says, I'm going to show you another one of my gruesome disease pictures. The world may be on the brink of another pandemic. All countries will be affected. Medical supplies will be inadequate. Large numbers of deaths will occur. Economic and social disruption will be great. So that's just 5 out of 10 things to look forward to. How bad can it get? It can get pretty bad. A few years ago, we had this conference at Stanford called A World at Risk, and they had all these very, very big-name people speaking at this conference, secretaries of state and defense and health ministers from around the world. And basically, it started breakfast, people talking. I think that was about nuclear proliferation and losing control of weapons of mass destruction. As the day goes on, we go into more and more disastrous topics. And the epidemic comes in the afternoon. By the sun was going down as this guy was talking about the epidemic. And you could see the entire room, everyone just wanted to kill themselves now. Get it over with. How bad can it get? It can get very, very bad. And I think one of the things people particularly seem to worry about is the breakdown of supply chains. Especially the food supply chain, that if we are dealing with an epidemic that kills 200 million people, say, we're going to have millions of people dying, millions of more people feeling terrible, and then many, many, many millions staying away from work because they don't want us to breathe our disgusting germs on them. We're likely to have a complete collapse of the global food supply and hundreds of millions of people starving. So this is a really, really awful scenario. And of course, I'm coming to the end now, going into increasingly depressing notes as we come nearer the end of the talk. Will a 21st century plague lead to an economic collapse on the scale of some of these ones that we've seen earlier? Well, I think long-term history, the kind I do, it tells you what to look for, but it doesn't actually tell you the answers. There's no way to learn the answers from the past. But you can at least, I think, get a sense of what problems we should be worrying about and looking at. And like I was saying, one of the big things we learned from comparing the post-Black Death Northwest Europe with post-Antonine Plague Roman Empire is that what makes the Black Death a relatively pleasant experience for Europe, bizarre way to put it, but what makes it so that the rebound is so big in Europe is that the economy grows faster than the population in Europe, in Northwest Europe after 1600, whereas that doesn't happen back in the Roman Empire. Now, I think there are some reasons to think that in the 21st century that could well happen, that our economies could grow faster than a population recovery in the aftermath of a major pandemic. But that, of course, that's up for debate among the experts on this. I think there's actually a much more immediate problem for a 21st century plague, which is one that was never faced by anybody before trying to deal with the plague. The horsemen of the apocalypse, as I emphasise, one of the big things that goes on when you get these 5 forces coming together is state failure and a great spike in violence and wars being fought. Back in the 2nd century or the 14th century, when people wanted to fight their wars, they had bows and arrows, and they could kill a lot of people with bows and arrows. We, however, have these, and these really kill a lot of people. In the past, every great social and economic collapse has been accompanied by a massive spike in violence. So it's not insane to suggest that if we were to see a great collapse in the 21st century, one of the things it would lead to was large-scale nuclear war. Now, this is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about lately, not altogether happily, but a lot of time thinking about this lately. And I've got a new book coming out, in fact, one last advertising opportunity, out in just a few weeks, out on April Fool's Day, which my publisher insists is a coincidence, looking at the long-term history of war and thinking very much about this potential future that's ahead of us. Now, back in the mid-1980s, various groups of defense consultants in the US were hired on to run war games, to try to figure out what are the likely death tolls if we have major nuclear war. And the first group that was hired on ran its war game, came back with the conclusion that out of the 6 billion or so people in the world at that point, we can expect 1 billion to be dead after the first week. And then unpredictable numbers of secondary deaths from hunger, disease, everything else that follows in its wake. Department of Defense really didn't like that prediction, so they hire another group who run their war game, come up with almost exactly the same results, and the third and the fourth, on it goes. Everybody comes to the same conclusion. At least 1 billion dead in the first week or so. Now, the bad news, we have vastly more powerful weapons available now than we did then. Here's just a small selection of them. The B-2 bomber that you see down at the bottom, that can carry a 10 megaton nuclear load. That is 750 Hiroshimas on one aircraft. So this is serious. This is scary. We have robot aircraft that can land and take off on aircraft carriers at sea with no humans being involved at all. This is multiple orders of magnitude increase in destructive power over what we had in World War II. Good news, though. The good news is that for every 20 nuclear warheads in the world in 1986, there is now one, and the number continues to fall. We actually could not kill everybody in the world in the first couple of weeks. It would take us weeks and weeks to build all the bombs we needed to do that. So this is pretty good news. We can't kill everyone at once anymore. But I want to close, though, actually, in spite of all this stuff, I want to close on a happy note. The big thing I felt I learned writing this book about war was that the story, the sort of, I think, little recognized happy story of the last 10,000 years is the growing human mastery of violence. And I realize that it's hard to recognize this when you're hearing news from Ukraine and Syria and all these other terrible things going on. But basically, across the last 10,000 years, rates of violent death have plunged. And this is one of the graphs I use in my new book. If you lived in a Stone Age society, probably you're facing a 10 to 20% risk of dying violently. In the early 21st century, globally, you're facing something like a 0.7% risk of dying violently. If you live in Denmark, your risk of dying violently is 1 in 111,000. This is good. This is a good trend. And I suggest in this new book that there are actually good reasons to think this is going to continue, that we are mastering the use of violence. And perhaps if we do have a new great epidemic in the 21st century, it won't end in the worst case scenario, which is nuclear war. So, okay, to conclude, let's go on to end with a typically depressing plague picture after all. Do plagues cause economic collapse? I think the answer has to be no, although they can contribute under the wrong circumstances. There's a serious risk of a great new plague in the 21st century. I suspect, though, not a serious risk of a major collapse of the kind that's been seen over and over again in the past with plagues. And that, at least, is some good news. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, what can I say? Ian, thank you for a fascinating overview of how different communities have been affected by plagues and the much longer-term consequences of those plagues, which I guess normally we would tend to ignore. We just focus on the immediate death and loss of population. I mean, we've had an awful lot of doom and gloom in this lecture series, and today is absolutely no exception. And I just think back to last week, we should be really worried about the global population growing too fast to, getting up to 10 billion. At the other extreme, We hear here that if the population increases rapidly after a plague, that will facilitate economic recovery. I mean, the happy medium in all of this is obviously almost impossible to achieve, so we have to hope that our societies, our human societies, are really ingenious and able to respond quickly to problems. So, next week, the 2014 Darwin College Lectures conclude with Dr. Rowan Williams from Magdalen College here in Cambridge, who's going to talk about plagues and metaphor. But Ian, you've given us a very important message. We can take comfort that plagues don't always result in major economic and social collapse. It could be worse. The answer, as you said at the beginning, is sometimes, not always. So let's hope the sometimes really is the outcome for our generations. Thank you very much indeed.